And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing a storm system here pulling northwestward and spreading gusty winds, rain into Kodiak Island, increasing rain here along the North Gulf Coast, and all the way to Yakutat there. Just some isolated showers over the remainder of the southeast coast. Interior mostly fair, clouds on the increase here across all of southern Alaska with precipitation on the increase here for the Bristol Bay area, back down toward the Alaska Peninsula, but dry all the way up to the Arctic coast. Light winds, scattered showers here over the Bering Sea, but still pretty windy St. Lawrence Island through the Bering Strait up to the western Arctic coast. And for tonight, those winds on the increase here with the high wind warnings kicking in after midnight or around midnight here, St. Lawrence Island, again all the way up to the western Arctic coast. Stays dry in the interior, but gradually tightening gradient starts picking the winds up a little bit here over areas, especially the higher elevation areas. Light winds, isolated rain and snow showers for the Aleutians. Rain along the coast of the Panhandle, North Gulf Coast. Rain, possibly heavy at times. Kodiak Island continues as that front tomorrow lies right over the island there with increasing moisture across the Kenai Peninsula and southern Cook Inlet. And then for Sunday, chance of rain, or a pretty good chance of rain here across much of southern Alaska, mostly south of the Sitna Valley and northern Cook Inlet right on the edge, but turning an arm eastward across Prince William Sound, periods of rain. And the Panhandle, gusty winds and rain for the entire area there. Also tightening gradient here, high pressure building over the north slope and falling pressures here to the south. So look for those increasing northeast winds there through the passes of the Brooks Range with some light snow here over the eastern Brooks Range up to the eastern Arctic coast, extreme eastern Arctic coast, Kaktovik, Barter Island. As you can see, dry to the west with mostly clear skies. Low pressure here south of the Pribilofs. Producing some showers here for the Alaska Peninsula and a little bit more widespread area of rain and snow showers on the back side of that down toward Atka into Nikolsky. And for the coastal water forecast along the coast of the Panhandle for Saturday, first day of the weekend, gale warnings, east to southeast winds at 35 knots. Central coast, east winds here 25 to 30 knots, and the north coast east at 40 knots with 24-foot seas. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, north at 25, northeast 25 for Passage Canal. Stevens Passage, east at 20 with higher gusts. And then for Sunday, we've got storm warnings out for the coastal areas of Prince of Wales Island. Southeast winds, 50 knots. Central coast here, southeast 40 to 45 knots. And for the north coast, east winds 30 to 40 knots here with seas over 20 feet everywhere here along the coast. And for Lynn Canal, small craft advisories, north winds at 25 with higher gusts, southeast 25 with higher gusts for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, gale warnings, southeast winds 35 knots, seas 12 feet. North Gulf Coast tomorrow, gale and storm warnings out. East winds 45 to 50 knots, seas 20 to 25 feet. Good storm warnings here for the Barren Islands. East 55, gusting 70 knots, seas 26 feet. Northeast at 50 knots, so storm warnings for Kamishak Bay. Cook Inlet, gale warnings. Northeast winds 35 to 40 knots. And Prince William Sound, east winds 30 knots, seas 7 feet. For Sunday, gale warnings now for southern Cook Inlet down across Kamishak Bay. Northeast at 35. Northern Cook Inlet, northeast at 30. Gale warnings now for Prince William Sound, east winds 40 knots with 10-foot seas there in the Sound. And for the North Gulf Coast, east winds 40 to 45 knots, northeast 40 for the Barren Islands with 20-foot seas. Kodiak Island, storm warnings in Shelikof Strait for those northeast winds sustained at 50 knots and east 45 knots on the east side of the island. And for the Alaska Peninsula, north to northeast winds 25 to 35 knots. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, northeast at 35 knots with 8-foot seas. And for Kodiak Island, Sunday, northeast 25 to 30 knots, and kind of a variable wind pattern here for the Alaska Peninsula again. West at 15 to 20 knots there on the Pacific side, and southeast to southwest at 20 on the Bering Sea side. Bristol Bay, northeast winds 20 knots. For the eastern Aleutians, northwest winds 20 to 30 knots. Lighter for Adak and Atka tomorrow, not too bad there, northwest at 15 knots. And for the western Aleutians, west to northwest winds 15 to 20 knots. And then for the day Sunday, Western Aleutians, gale warnings for 35 to 40 knot winds out in that area, and west at 25 knots for Adak and Atka, west winds 25 to 30 knots for the Fox Islands. And for the southwest coast and St. Lawrence Island, northeast winds tomorrow at 30 knots in those areas, northeast about 25 there for Norton Sound, northeast 25 for the Pribilofs. Gale warnings here, St. Matthew Island, northeast winds 35 knots. And for the day on Sunday, gale warnings now for Norton Sound, northeast at 35 knots with northeast at 30 for St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta Coast, northeast 25, Kuskokwim Delta Coast. Pribilofs north 30 knots, St. Matthew Island north winds at 40 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, north to northeast winds 25 to 35 knots. And pretty brisk there even for the western Arctic coast, northeast at 25 there. Central coast dropping back to 15 knots. And then we've got light variable winds for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast for the first day of the weekend, down to 5 to 10 knots. And then for Sunday, north at 10 for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, 15 knots out of the north for the central coast. Brisk wind advisories continue for the western Arctic coast, north winds at 25 knots. Gale warnings now for the Chukchi Sea. Those north winds at north to northeast winds, 35 to 40 knots.